The tropics just woke up, and if you live anywhere near the Gulf Coast or the southeastern United States, this is the update you need to see right now. After a quiet stretch to start the 2026 Atlantic hurricane season, activity is ramping up fast, and the National Hurricane Center is now tracking real developing system EMs instead of just watching empty ocean. Let's break down exactly what's happening, what meteorologists are saying could come next, and what you should actually be doing to prepare. Because it only takes one isn't just a slogan forecasters repeat for fun. It's the single most important sentence in this entire video. First, let's set the stage with where this season has been so far, because context matters here. Heading into 2026, most of the major forecasting groups, including NOAA, Colorado State University, and Tropical Storm Risk, all pointed toward a below-normal Atlantic hurricane C. Hasten. The reasoning behind that forecast centers on a strengthening El Niño pattern, which tends to increase wind shear across the Atlantic basin. Wind shear is essentially strong upper-level winds that can tear apart a developing storm before it has a chance to organize. And a strong El Niño typically means more of it across the areas where storms usually form and intensify. NOAA's official outlook pointed to a below-normal season driven by competing factors, with El Niño expected to develop and intensify through the season while Atlantic Ocean temperatures ran slightly warmer than normal and trade winds stayed weaker than average. Colorado State University's forecasters landed in a similar place, projecting somewhat below normal activity for the season, with roughly 13 named storms, 6 hurricanes, and 2 major hurricanes, expected against a long-term average of about 14, 7, and 3, respectively. So, on paper, this was supposed to be a quieter year, and for the first several weeks of the season, it mostly was. But quiet doesn't mean nothing, and it definitely doesn't mean safe. Earlier this month, the basin's first-named storm of the year, Arthur, formed just off the Texas coast. And even as a relatively weak system, it still produced real, tangible impacts, including significant and potentially life-threatening flooding as its remnants tracked across Louisiana before pushing into Georgia and the Carolinas. That's worth sitting with for a second, because Arthur wasn't a major hurricane. It wasn't even particularly strong. And it still caused flooding serious enough for meteorologists to specifically flag it as life-threatening in some areas. This is exactly why below normal season forecasts should never be read as nothing to worry about. A below normal season with fewer storms can still absolutely produce a storm that ruins someone's entire year. Now here's what's changed just in the last day or two, and it's the real reason tropical activity is suddenly back in the headlines. As of this weekend, the National Hurricane Center has been tracking an area of low pressure over the northeastern Gulf, and as of the most recent update, the NHC is now issuing advisories on newly formed Tropical Depression 2, located over the northeastern Gulf of America. This system developed out of an area that forecasters have been watching for several days, and it climbed steadily in formation probability before officially organizing into a depression. Just a day earlier, meteorologists were already flagging the system as increasingly likely to develop, reporting the area of low pressure carried a high chance, around 80%, of developing into a tropical depression or storm within 2 to 7 days, with the next name on the list being Bertha. So what does this actually mean for people along the coast? A couple of important things. First, regardless of exactly how strong the system becomes or whether it officially strengthens into Tropical Storm Bertha, forecasters have been clear that it's expected to be a significant rainmaker for parts of the Gulf Coast no matter what. That's an important distinction that a lot of people miss when they're watching tropical updates. The category number, or even whether a system gets a name at all, isn't the only thing that determines impact. Slow-moving tropical systems, even relatively weak ones, can sit over an area and dump enormous amounts of rainfall over a short period, leading to flash flooding, overflowing rivers, and dangerous road conditions, all without ever reaching hurricane strength. We just saw exactly this play out with Arthur a couple weeks ago. Second, location matters enormously here, and this is where I want to be precise instead of vague, because vague tropical coverage is how people either panic unnecessarily or, worse, don't take a real threat seriously enough. Current forecast tracks have this system moving toward the central Gulf Coast, and multiple local meteorologists covering the story have specifically noted that, based on current guidance, this system is not expected to pose a direct threat to the Carolinas. That doesn't mean the Carolinas are in the clear from all tropical activity this season. It simply means this specific system, right now, based on current model guidance, is tracking toward the Gulf Coast states rather than the southeast Atlantic coastline. If you live in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, or the Florida Panhandle, this is the system you want to be paying closest attention to over the next several days. It's also worth mentioning that this Gulf system hasn't been the only area of interest this month. Earlier in July, the National Hurricane Center was simultaneously monitoring a separate tropical wave that had emerged off the coast of Africa, southeast of the Cabo Verde Islands, which is the classic breeding ground for the strongest, most long-lived Atlantic hurricanes later in the season. That system showed some organization over a couple of days as it tracked west-northwestward, but forecasters expected it to move into an environment unfavorable for further development by the following weekend, keeping formation chances low. TEM ultimately didn't develop into anything, which is a good reminder that not every wave the Hurricane Center flags for monitoring actually becomes a named storm. But it's exactly why meteorologists watch these systems continuously throughout the season rather than only reacting once something is already spinning. Now let's talk about why this pattern, quiet start, sudden uptick in activity in mid to late July, is actually pretty normal, even in a below normal season. Historically, the Atlantic hurricane season follows a well-documented seasonal rhythm. June and the first half of July are typically suppressed by dry, dusty air streaming off the Sahara Desert combined with sinking G-air across much of the basin, both of which work against tropical development. Then, moving through August, September, and into October, conditions typically become far more conducive, which is why the peak of hurricane season historically lands right around September 10th. What we're seeing right now, this uptick in activity in the back half of July, often marks the transition period where the basin starts shifting out of that early season suppression and toward more favorable conditions, even in years where a strong El Niño is expected to keep overall seasonal numbers down. This is genuinely important context because a below normal seasonal forecast can create a false sense of security that leads people to underprepare, and then when the first real system of the year shows up, they're caught off guard. Meteorologists have been explicit about this exact risk for years, regardless of how many named storms are predicted for a season overall. Coastal residents are consistently reminded that it only takes a single storm, making landfall in your specific area, to turn what looks like a quiet year on paper into the worst weather event of your life. A below normal season forecast tells you something about the entire Atlantic basin over 6 months. It tells you almost nothing about whether the one storm that actually reaches your specific coastline this year is going to be manageable or catastrophic. So with all of that context, let's talk about what you should actually be doing right now if you live anywhere along the Gulf Coast, the southeastern coastline, or frankly, anywhere within reach of a tropical system this season. First, and this is the most basic step, but the one people skip most often, know your evacuation zone. If you live in a coastal county, your local emergency management office has almost certainly published an evacuation zone APE, usually available on their website or through a quick search of your county name plus evacuation zone. Look this up now before a storm is bearing down on you, because during an actual emergency, you don't want to be trying to figure out for the first time whether you're in a mandatory evacuation area while roads are already filling up with traffic. Second, put together or refresh your emergency supply kit. This means enough non-perishable food and water for every member of your household, ideally enough for at least 3 to 7 days, along with any necessary medications, a battery-powered or hand-crank radio, flashlights, extra batteries, a first aid kit, and copies of important documents like insurance information and identification kept somewhere waterproof. If you already have a kit from a previous season, now is the time to check expiration dates on food, water, and medications, and replace anything that's outdated. Third, review your insurance coverage, and do this well before a storm is actually threatening your area, because many flood insurance policies have a waiting period before coverage takes effect, often around 30 days. If you wait until a storm is already forming in the Gulf to try to add flood coverage, it will likely be too late for that policy to help you with that specific storm. Standard homeowners insurance typically does not cover flood damage at all, which surprises a lot of people after the fact. If you're in a flood-prone area, or honestly, even if you're not, since plenty of unexpected flooding has happened well outside traditional flood zones in recent years, it's worth having an actual conversation with your insurance provider now about what is and isn't covered. Fourth, have a communication plan with your family, especially if you have family members who don't all live together. Decide in advance on an out-of-area contact person that everyone can check in with if local phone lines or cell towers become overloaded or damaged, since it's often easier to make a long-distance call out of an affected area than a local call within it during a major event. Fifth, and this applies specifically to what's happening right now, pay attention to rainfall and flooding risk, even if a storm never becomes a hurricane or even a named tropical storm. As we've already discussed, Arthur caused significant flooding without ever becoming a major system. And this current Gulf disturbance is expected to be a heavy rain producer regard, less of its exact classification. If you live in a low-lying area or somewhere with a history of street or yard flooding during heavy rain events, don't wait for a hurricane warning to start paying attention. Flash flooding from a slow-moving tropical system can develop quickly, and rainfall totals from tropical systems can be genuinely staggering, sometimes exceeding a foot of rain in a single area over just a day or two. Finally, make sure you're actually getting your tropical updates from a reliable source, and check it regularly, rather than relying on whatever surfaces in your social media feed. The National Hurricane Center's website updates its tropical weather outlook multiple times daily during active periods, and your local national Their service office will have specific, localized guidance for your area as any system develops. Local meteorologists at your regional news stations are also generally excellent, reliable sources during active tropical events, since they combine national forecast data with specific local knowledge about how systems tend to behave in your particular region. Let's zoom back out for a second, because I think the bigger picture here is actually more useful than any single system currently on the map. This season was forecast to be below normal, and it may well end up being below normal by the time it's all said and done in November. But we've already seen one system cause life-threatening flooding, and we're now watching a second system organize with a genuinely high chance of development, expected to dump significant rainfall across the Gulf Coast, regardless of exactly how strong it gets. That's the pattern worth remembering all season long, not just right now while this specific system is active. Overall, seasonal activity numbers are useful for understanding general risk levels and for emergency planner. Thinking about resource allocation across an entire 6-month period. They are not useful for predicting whether your specific town, your specific street, is going to take a direct hit this year. That risk exists in every single Atlantic hurricane season, below normal or not, and the only real defense against it is being prepared before a system is already spinning off your coastline, not after. So here's the actual takeaway. Tropical Depression 2 has just formed in the northeastern Gulf, with a high likelihood of further development and a strong chance it becomes Tropical Storm Bertha in the coming days. Regardless of its final strength, it's expected to bring significant rainfall to parts of the Gulf Coast, and current tracks keep the more serious flooding and wind impacts away from the Carolinas, though that could still shift as the system develops. So keep watching official updates rather than relying on today's forecast alone. If you're anywhere along the Gulf Coast from Louis, Siana through the Florida Panhandle, this is the week to finalize your preparations, not the week you're scrambling to buy water and batteries after the shelves are already empty. Stay tuned to your local National Weather Service office and the National Hurricane Center over the coming days for updates as this system develops. And if you found this breakdown useful, keep an eye out for updates as we draw back how this plays out, because the tropics are clearly starting to wake up, and this almost certainly won't be the last system we're covering before this season wraps up in November.